There is a steel tube, roughly 3 meters long, sitting inside a Russian howitzer somewhere near the Ukrainian front line right now, and it is already dying. Not from a strike, not from a fire, from use. Every time the gun fires, the metal inside that barrel erodes a little more until one day it simply cannot be trusted to fire straight again. For most of this war, nobody outside a small circle of engineers thought that fact mattered very much. Guns get damaged, guns get repaired, the war grinds on. Then, sometime in 2025, a group of Ukrainian officers looked at that dying piece of steel and asked a very different question. What if you could make it die faster, on purpose, at scale, without anyone noticing for a year? Not with a bigger bomb? Not with a more expensive missile, with a much smaller, much more precise strike aimed at the one part of the gun that can never simply be welded back together. It sounds almost too small a detail to build a year-long secret campaign around. That, it turns out, is exactly the point. On July 1st, 2026, the answer to that question finally had a name. Ukraine's Defense Minister, Mykhailo Fedorov, stood at a technology event in Kyiv called Brave One Advantage and, almost in passing, mentioned a campaign that had been running in near total secrecy since May of the previous year. He called it Ashan. Then he gave a number that should stop anyone scrolling past it. Across 2 quiet phases, Ukrainian forces had struck 1,180 Russian targets. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery. Confirmed, according to the ministry, strike by strike, on camera. And the reveal did not happen on some random Tuesday. It happened during the exact same week that Vladimir Putin sat in front of a state television camera and described Russian troops standing on the bank of a river that, according to every publicly available military map, does not exist. Picture the room where that number was announced. Not a war room, not a dramatic press conference with a giant screen behind the podium, but a technology showcase full of drone startups and government officials trading business cards, the kind of event where a life and death revelation gets sandwiched between a panel on manufacturing and a coffee break. That mismatch between setting and substance is itself worth noticing. Officials with genuinely bad news or genuinely fragile good news tend to dress it up. Officials confident enough in what they're holding sometimes just say it out loud and move on to the next slide. So here is the question worth sitting with for the next 15 minutes. How does a country hide over 1,000 confirmed kills for more than a year? And why did it choose this particular week to stop hiding them? Start with what Fedorov actually said, because the way he said it matters almost as much as the numbers themselves. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't stage a dramatic announcement with maps and slides. He folded Ashan into a broader briefing about Ukraine's drone programs almost as an afterthought, the way you might mention a major life event in the middle of small talk. The first phase, he explained, used specially built bomber drones paired with reconnaissance, hunting tanks, and armor deep behind Russian lines, more than 50 kilometers behind the front, according to some reporting. In just a handful of nights, more than 800 pieces of equipment were destroyed, part of a first phase total that officials later put at 949 confirmed targets in 3 days. Then came the line that deserves a genuine pause. For roughly 6 months afterward, Russian forces did not launch a single mechanized offensive. A push that had reportedly been planned for May of 2025 didn't happen until October, half a year late, and almost nobody watching the news at the time understood why. That is not a rounding error. That is half a year of a modern military's own offensive timeline being quietly rewritten by an operation the public didn't know existed. Fedorov then moved to Phase 2, the one Ukraine ran this past June under a related name, ArtAshan. This time, the target wasn't armor. It was artillery specifically, hit across 4 sectors: Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Starobilsk. The official count: 231 targets struck, 171 confirmed destroyed. And within a single day of those strikes landing, Russian artillery activity across those exact sectors fell somewhere between 30 and 81%. To put that kind of drop in perspective, that is the difference between a battlefield that is shelling your positions every night and one that has gone almost silent by the following morning. Imagine a factory floor that is running at full capacity on Monday and operating at less than a fifth of its usual output by Tuesday. That is what an artillery battery experiences when this campaign finds it. Now here is a detail that should, paradoxically, make you trust this story more rather than less. Weeks before the full numbers came out, in an earlier interview, Fedorov had already given reporters a preliminary figure: 250 artillery pieces destroyed in just 2 nights. When the ministry finished its full verification, the real number came in lower: 171, not 250. That is not how propaganda usually behaves. Inflated claims tend to grow with retelling, not shrink. A number that gets smaller once it is actually checked is a strange thing to fake. And it is worth remembering the next time any official, on either side of this war, hands you a headline figure before the paperwork is finished. So why artillery specifically? Fedorov gave the answer himself, and it reframes everything that follows. According to internal general staff reporting, a significant share of Ukrainian battlefield casualties, by some estimates well over 10% on parts of the front and closer to 20% in the worst sectors, were coming from enemy shellfire, not tank assaults, not infantry pushes, but sustained artillery bombardment, day after day, on fixed positions. The ministry looked at that casualty data and decided the priority wasn't a headline, it was survival. And that reframes the entire engineering problem Ukraine had to solve. Drones had already been hitting Russian howitzers for years by this point. The trouble was that a damaged gun is rarely a destroyed gun. Hit the chassis, hit the ammunition rack, and Russian crews can often tow the system back, repair it, and return it to a firing position within days. The strike looks devastating on video. The actual cost to Russia is a short delay, a few days off the schedule, nothing more. So Ukrainian engineers stopped aiming at the machine and started aiming at one specific 30-centimeter wide piece of it, the barrel. A gun with a ruptured barrel isn't damaged, it's finished. There's no welding that back together in a field workshop, no towing it to a rear depot for a quick swap. Ukraine says it verified every one of these strikes using what the ministry calls objective control footage, cross-checked against intercepted Russian radio traffic, a real methodology, though one worth flagging honestly. It hasn't yet been independently cross-checked by the open-source trackers who usually verify battlefield losses using public visual evidence alone. That gap between official confirmation and independent verification is the kind of thing a careful investigation names rather than glosses over. None of this happens by accident, either. Every strike inside this campaign reportedly runs through a system called Delta, Ukraine's real-time battlefield network, which pulls together drone footage, satellite imagery, and human intelligence into a single shared picture of the front. For a campaign like ArtAshan, targets are said to be logged into Delta before the drones responsible for hitting them ever leave the ground, so operators already know precisely where to look the moment a mission launches. There is no cold searching across empty terrain, no burning flight time hunting for a howitzer that may have already moved. That kind of preparation is the difference between a strike that happens to work and a campaign that can be repeated, sector after sector, month after month, without reinventing the process each time. It helps to picture exactly which guns are on the receiving end of this campaign. The backbone of Russian fire support is the 2 S-19 Msta-S, a 152mm self-propelled howitzer that has been in Russian service since the late 1980s and remains, by a wide margin, the most heavily represented system in these strikes. When losses on that gun start piling up, Russia has increasingly reached back into long-term storage for older Soviet-era systems instead of relying purely on fresh production, a sign in itself of how tight the supply of ready artillery has become. none of that older equipment is immune to the same underlying problem. A barrel is a barrel, whether it sits on a decades-old gun pulled out of a storage yard or a system rolling off the line this year, and every one of them wears out a little faster than most people outside artillery circles realize, especially under the kind of sustained firing rates this war has demanded for 4 straight years. And this is where the story stops being only a battlefield story and becomes an industrial one. A modern, self-propelled howitzer barrel is not something you machine in a garage overnight. It requires enormous, specialized rotary forging equipment, the kind the Soviet Union itself once had to import from Austria in the 1970s because it could not build the machinery domestically. Analysts who track Russia's defense industry say only a small handful of facilities in the entire country, concentrated around plants like Ural-Transmash in Yekaterinburg, can actually produce these barrels at any meaningful scale. And according to Ukrainian defense industry analysts at Defense Express, part of that limited production chain depends on imported chromium, a raw material Russia does not fully produce at home, at a moment when Western sanctions have made international sourcing significantly harder than it used to be. Let that sit for a second. Ukraine didn't just build a smarter bomb. It engineered a weapon that goes straight at the single most bottlenecked, hardest to replace physical component inside Russia's entire fire support system, a component manufactured in a handful of factories that Moscow cannot simply order into existence somewhere else. Every gun destroyed the old way is a repair bill and a delay measured in days. Every gun destroyed this new way is a permanent subtraction from a supply chain Russia cannot expand on demand, no matter how much money the Kremlin throws at it, and no matter how many shells North Korea ships across the border to keep the guns fed. Here is where the story turns, because the same week Ukraine was quietly revealing a year of verified, filmed destruction, Vladimir Putin was on Russian state television doing something close to the opposite. In an interview broadcast on June 28th, Putin told viewers Russian forces were roughly 10.5 kilometers from the city of Sumy. Independent open-source mapping groups, including Deep State, put the real distance at closer to 17 to 19 kilometers, essentially double what he claimed on camera. Putin also described a Ukrainian force of around 5,000 troops pinned against something he called the Starry Oskol River. Here is the problem. There is no river by that name. Starry Oskol is a real place, but it is a city in Russia's own Belgorod region, more than 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Putin appears to have meant the Oskil River, an actual waterway roughly in the area he was gesturing toward, and simply attached the wrong name to it, live, on air, while describing an encirclement that Ukraine's own military dismissed, and that Western analysts say has no supporting evidence at all. The Institute for the Study of War went further, examining Putin's claims about Kostiantynivka, where he said Russian troops held 96% of the city. Their geolocated mapping put the real figure closer to 37%. His claimed distances to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk came in at roughly half the real geolocated numbers as well. This wasn't one slip. It was a pattern, repeated across nearly every location he mentioned that week, and independent analysts have described it as a deliberate attempt to make the front line sound the same as, or better than, it looked a year earlier, even as the actual battlefield had changed dramatically in Ukraine's favor. So consider the contrast sitting right in front of you. On one side, a defense ministry quietly releasing a year of camera-verified strikes it didn't even need to announce at all. On the other, the head of state going on national television and getting the basic geography of his own war wrong in public on the very same week. If you had to guess which side was actually under more pressure to look strong right now, which one would you pick? Because the ground truth Ukraine's own commanders were describing that same week was considerably more serious than a mislabeled river. On June 30th, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, told the national broadcaster TSN that Putin had personally ordered the Russian general staff to draw up multiple options for a renewed offensive, including one launched from Belarusian territory aimed at Kyiv itself. 12 border settlements in Chernihiv region began mandatory evacuations on July 1st as a precaution, with evacuation orders extended for 7 more that had already been cleared once over the winter. To his credit, Syrskyi didn't oversell the threat. He said he doubts Belarus's leadership would risk handing over its territory again, given how the war has gone, and Ukrainian intelligence has not observed troop concentrations on that border capable of supporting an actual invasion force. The far more realistic scenario, in his own words, is a narrower push from Russia's Bryansk region directly into Chernihiv, not to seize the capital, but to stretch Ukraine's front line thin enough that Kyiv is forced to pull reserves away from the sectors where Ukrainian forces currently hold the initiative. Even that narrower route is not an easy one for Russia. The terrain along the Belarusian approach to Kyiv is heavily forested and marshy, difficult ground for the kind of mechanized columns Russia attempted and lost along that same corridor back in February 2022. Geography alone will not stop an offensive, but it does mean any renewed push north needs exactly the kind of armor and artillery support that has spent the last year quietly being ground down somewhere else entirely. Here is an honest caveat worth stating plainly, because a fair investigation names its own uncertainties instead of hiding them. No named military analyst has explicitly drawn a straight line from the ArtAshan artillery losses to Russia's actual capacity to mount this specific offensive. That connection is an inference built from timing and geography, not a sourced claim from a named expert. But it is a difficult inference to dismiss, because any renewed Russian push toward Chernihiv would need exactly the kind of artillery support this campaign has spent over a year quietly grinding down, one barrel at a time, in sectors hundreds of kilometers away. And while Russia's hardware was being hollowed out in silence, something else was cracking apart in full public view, this time inside Russia's financial establishment. At Sberbank's annual shareholder meeting, CEO German Gref, one of the longest-serving pillars of Putin's economic circle, and a man who has clashed with the Kremlin over interest rates before, told the room plainly that the fastest possible end to the war was the single issue on the mind of essentially every Russian citizen. He paired that comment with warnings about an economy straining under high interest rates, falling investment, and a currency the central bank has struggled to manage. His statement lines up almost perfectly with independent polling showing 81% of Russians now favor an immediate halt to the invasion, the highest figure recorded at any point in the war. State television's leading war propagandist, Vladimir Solovyov, responded in a way that revealed exactly how uncomfortable Gref's comment was inside Kremlin circles. Rather than argue with it directly, Solovyov misquoted Gref on air, quietly inserting the phrase, "with our victory," into a sentence Gref never actually said. Weeks later, in what looked very much like quiet punishment, Solovyov was left off the guest list for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Russia's premier annual economic showcase, for the first time in his career. Separate polling shows support for his own hardline position, a war fought without limits, ending only in total victory, sliding from 13% down to 9%. Even his own audience appears to be walking away from him. A propagandist losing his own viewers is a small thing on its own. A propagandist losing his own viewers in the same month his country's most powerful banker publicly begs for peace is not a small thing. It is the sound of a narrative losing its grip in real time, in front of the very cameras built to control it. Put those two threads side by side. One arm of Russia's war machine is quietly running out of the guns it needs to fight. The other arm of Russia's public messaging is publicly disagreeing with itself about whether the fighting should even continue on live television in front of millions of viewers. That is not the picture of a country approaching this war from a position of strength, whatever the maps on state TV are made to show. But an honest investigation resists a tidy ending, because a tidy ending usually means something got left out. Analysts tracking Russia's shell and artillery output note that production has climbed substantially since the early years of the full-scale invasion, aided by supply arrangements with North Korea, even as the exact current totals remain disputed among different trackers. Russia's storage depots, while thinning and skewing toward older, harder-to-restore equipment, are far from empty. Repair and replace has kept Russia's war machine running for 4 straight years despite losses at exactly this scale before, and nothing about the ArtAshan reveal changes that underlying industrial reality by itself. A war economy that can still manufacture ammunition in bulk is not the same as a war economy in collapse, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of satisfying but inaccurate ending this investigation is trying to avoid. Both things can be true in the same sentence: a factory that is still producing shells, and a barrel supply chain that is genuinely struggling to keep pace with what this campaign is destroying. The war doesn't turn on one number. It turns on which of those two trend lines bends first. Russia can, on paper, still order a new offensive. The question this entire campaign raises isn't whether Russia can order one. It's whether Russia can actually execute one on the schedule Moscow wants, with the specific artillery tools that a renewed push through Chernihiv would require, at a moment when its most irreplaceable component is being hunted down barrel by barrel. Zoom out, and the scale of what is happening becomes clearer still. Ukraine's targeting network, known as Delta, reportedly feeds strikes against thousands of Russian objects every single day across the entire front, part of a running total that dwarfs the 1,180 targets counted inside Ashan and ArtAshan alone. Those two operations aren't an isolated success story sitting off to one side of the war. They're the sharpest, most precisely engineered edge of a much larger machine, one that keeps working whether anyone outside a briefing room in Kyiv is watching or not, night after night, in sectors most viewers will never see mentioned on the news at all. And there is an economic thread running underneath all of it that rarely makes the headlines. Every barrel Russia loses has to be replaced through a supply chain squeezed by sanctions. Every replacement competes for the same scarce chromium and the same handful of forges, and every month that competition drags on is a month Russia's defense budget, and by extension its already strained civilian economy, absorbs another cost it did not plan for. So here is the honest verdict, delivered without a satisfying bow tied around it, because this war has earned a healthy suspicion of satisfying bows. Russia's factories can still, in raw output, outproduce what Ukraine manages to destroy. Nothing about 1,180 targets or a barrel-rupturing shell guarantees this war ends on anyone's preferred schedule. But every time Russia has tried to turn a plan drawn up in Moscow into an actual offensive on the ground, something Moscow didn't put on its own calendar has kept getting in the way. A mechanized push planned for spring showed up in autumn instead. A renewed offensive is reportedly being sketched out toward Chernihiv, while the guns it would need are being taken apart in a Ukrainian operation the Kremlin didn't even know existed until it was already over. Does that mean the war is closer to ending? Or is this simply another chapter in a conflict that still has a long way left to run? 1,000 destroyed guns is a real number. So is a Russian shell production line that analysts say is still running at a scale far above where it started this war. Both of those things are true at the same time, and this war may ultimately be decided by whichever one runs out first, the guns Russia can keep fielding or the political patience holding Moscow's public story together. Tell us which side of that question you land on and why in the comments below. Because the same week a defense ministry quietly closed the book on a year-long secret operation, Russia's own state television was busy trying to explain away a fuel crisis at home that its own bankers are now begging Putin to fix. That is a very different kind of steel bottleneck, one measured in gasoline lines instead of gun barrels, and it's the subject of the next investigation on this channel. This has been Dr. Nathan Mercer, and this is the geopolitical investigation into the war in Ukraine.